Let's get started here, everybody. Welcome. I'm Glenn Ruga, the founder and director of the Social Documentary Network. I know many of you, but it's always great to see some new faces, and people have been brought in by some of our other panelists, which is great. Welcome to this program on images of conflict and peace, curated by Meg Gray. Sorry, Meg. This is part of SDN's Documentary Matters program, where we bring together photographers and other professionals to discuss documentary photography and the issues presented in photos. This program really took off when COVID first started, and we've done dozens of programs like this, and it's really been great to reach out to people all over the world. This particular Documentary Matters program came out of a seminar at the NYU Gallatin School titled Photographing Peace, taught by Dr. Lauren Walsh, one of the panelists today. Meg Gray, a student in the seminar, interned with SDN this past spring and developed this program while drawing from research she conducted while in the class. We have 5 presenters today, 4 talking about their photographic work from Bosnia, Rwanda, Colombia, and United States. And Professor Walsh will give an overview of making images of conflict and peace. And at the end of the presentations, we'll have a Q&A. You can post your questions to the chat, or you can use the raise your hand function. We may call on you to ask your question directly, or we may read your question depending on how they come in. And I'm sorry, I need to admit some people from the waiting room. And Meg, if you can keep an eye on that for the next few minutes. The chat is open now, and if you want to say where you're Zooming from, that would be great. Just go into the chat and let us know where you're from. And today's program is being recorded. It will be available on the SDN YouTube channel within a few days, and we'll send out a notice to everybody here to let them know. And this event is being co-sponsored by Digital Silver Imaging in Belmont, Mass. They've co-sponsored all the Documentary Matters programs. So now let me turn this over to Meg Gray.
Hi, I'm Meg. Thank you all so much for joining our panel today, hosted by Documentary Matters and the Social Documentary Network, Images of Conflict and Peace. I also really want to reiterate my gratitude for our panelists today, Dr. Lauren Walsh, Steve Cagan, Glenn Ruga, Allen Storey, and Shoun Hill. They've joined us today to present their diverse portfolios depicting conflict and peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda, Colombia, and the United States. These nations differ geographically, but they do share similar themes of violence, reconciliation, and hope. They inform viewers of how peace and conflict comes to be. I'm really looking forward to this panel today, and we're going to begin with Dr. Lauren Walsh.
Hi, thank you everyone who is joining, and also just a special thanks to Glenn and to Meg, our moderator. I've never before had a panel that grows directly from a course that I've taught. So this is exciting for me to be here today and to see one of my students kind of leading the whole thing and organizing this entire panel. I thought what I would do today, I will share my screen. Here we go. Oops, sorry. Let me try that one more time, take 2. I thought what I would do today is talk to you a little bit about who I am and how this led me to teaching a course called Photographing Peace, which is what led us into this panel of illustrious experts today. So I wear a few hats. I'll come back to what's on the screen in a moment. I am a professor at NYU, as Meg said. I'm a filmmaker, I'm a cultural critic, I'm an author, I'm a photo editor. And my field of expertise is the visual coverage of conflict, and more specifically, the photojournalistic coverage of conflict. And so that entails war zones, humanitarian crises, natural disasters. And I put this on screen. It's a book of mine that came out about 2.5 years ago. And I wanted to just talk us through a little bit of kind of the photography of conflict. So this book is a deep dive or attempts to peel back the layers involved in covering conflict in all those forms that I just named, and particularly in thinking through every aspect from what it takes to make the picture to the path that image will travel until it reaches your, whether newspaper in print or more likely these days screen that you're looking at it on. And I structured the book as a series of interviews with photographers who cover conflict around the world, and with photo editors who also play a pretty definitive role in shaping at least a portion of the imagery that reaches us, right? Which assignments am I giving? How am I curating this body of work? Will I publish this or not publish this? And along the way, the book is also exploring things like the physical risks that photographers are facing, the emotional tolls, forces that act as censors, even questions like what's the value of a single image in the age of Instagram and TikTok. So that's my field and where I'm kind of housed broadly. I also have expertise in a few specific conflicts, and I'll talk to us about them very briefly because we have panelists here who are going to say more on these topics. But this leads towards my structuring of this class on photographing peace, and it also leads towards some of the questions that we asked in that seminar. So one of the areas where I have a particular expertise is Colombia, which witnessed the longest running conflict in the Western Hemisphere. And I worked with a photographer, Alvaro Ibarra-Zavela, who was documenting there for well over a decade. And I worked with him as the photo editor on his book and as the curator on the exhibition that grew from this. And what's interesting for our purposes today, it's a body of work that looks at this conflict from a multiplicity of perspectives. And it was very much still a conflict when we started assembling and curating this work. And right as the book and the exhibition were supposed to come out, the peace treaty was signed. And we felt it very important to think through questions like, what does it mean to bring forward a body of visual documentation at a moment when a country is supposed to transition from war into peace? How should we look at these images? What role will they play in the history of this country? Can they be tools towards a transition into a state of peace? And so those are some of the questions. We wound up redoing text in the book to foreground these kinds of questions and this sort of thinking. I also have a real expertise in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, and especially in Bosnia and the Bosnian War. And that's because I do a number of projects there. I'll just quickly touch on two of them. One is a documentary film that is supposed to come out next year. It's called Biography of a Photo. My co-director is Ron Haviv, who's a photographer who covered the Bosnian War extensively. And as you can see from this is our poster, the film poster. It's kind of a mashup of two images. And you can tell even just from the little glimpses you have here, these are images they're bloody. They're images of conflict. And essentially one of the premises of this film is that it's about a photograph that was taken in 1992 at the very, very beginning of the Bosnian War. And that photo has remained iconic in the country to this day. So it's this trajectory of what happens with an image over time. What are the afterlives of an image, even as a country moves from war into peace? What is the role that image plays? And again, this is a book that just came out last year with Ron Haviv and myself. Again, he's the photographer and I'm the writer. And I just have one page spread from the book on the screen here. And it's images, many of which were never published before, images from the Bosnian War. And these are specific to a devastating massacre that occurred in a place called Srebrenica in Bosnia. And here again, my task, or I took it upon myself as the writer, was thinking through what is the value of this archive 25 years after the war has ended? What does it mean to see images of war that were not published at the time when the war was occurring, but they are resonant with this culture today? And I should say that Bosnia, to this day, although there is no active war, remains socially and politically very turbulent. And this connects very directly to the peace treaty that was drawn up in 1995 and has kind of set in motion a long history that is very messy. And it raises very interesting questions about peace and how a country gets into a state of peace. So Okay, and I just want to start bringing this together as topics that I presented to my students in this class, photographing peace. One of the things that was very important to me when I conducted the interviews for this book, I just have 4 of the images on screen here, was when certain photographers would tell me, I wanted to cover post-war, I wanted to cover aftermath, I wanted to cover peace. And some of them were able to do so, and others were saying to me, but nobody wanted to give me that assignment. Nobody wanted me to go and take those pictures. I was told it's not important enough. I was told they're not going to be visual enough. I was told the audience wouldn't care enough. And that, of course, was distressing to me, right? Why is it that war gets coverage? And of course, Ukraine is a great example. War gets a ton of coverage, a ton of attention. Is it really the case that we are more interested in war than peace? Is it really the case that we are more compelled to look at graphic images than quote unquote, boring images or quiet images? And so that was the starting point for this course, asking questions like, can we use the camera to avoid certain kinds of violence? Can we report on violence or suffering differently? And what would that look like? So I put this on screen. This is literally directly lifted from my syllabus. It's part of the course description. And the premise is, what does peace look like? What are the visual narratives of post-conflict societies, and how do they conform to or complicate our generalized notions and expectations around what peace means, right? And it goes from there. Quick overview. This is the basic structure of my seminar. We look at kind of 5 case studies. Bosnia, Rwanda, Colombia, and US and Black Lives Matter are part of this panel today. And essentially what we do is we study the visual coverage at the time of war, or the time of genocide, or the time of conflict, and then we look at aftermath, or we look at the visual coverage 10 years later or 30 years later. And US and Black Lives Matter, of course, this is not technically, in the legal sense, a war, but I felt compelled to bring some of these questions right back home, right? I teach at NYU, we're in New York, we're all in the United States, and we are surrounded by endemic racism and conflict. And I wanted to ask these questions of peace around this as a topic. So I'm not going to say too much more about these various histories or these various topics, because we have wonderful co-panelists who will do that. I'll just talk a little bit about some of the questions that I brought to my students. What is peace journalism? Which is a term, I just don't think it's a term that is taught very much. What is solutions journalism? Can photography activate change? How can photography minimize harm? Can photography be a part of peace processes or peace building? We also spent time talking about peace photography, not just as a state of coming after a war has ended, but the concepts attached to peace photography. Can they be activated during war? Can they push towards peace building? Can journalism do better to explain underlying causes of systemic injustices? And especially, how can photography show us something systemic or endemic? And again, this last question, what does peace look like? So when I walked into class on the first day of the semester, the very first question I asked was, what does war look like? And my students had ready answers. War looks like combatants. It looks like soldiers in uniform. It looks like AK-47s and tanks and dead bodies. And they agreed on this. And then I said, what does peace look like? And there was no shared or collective understanding of what peace looks like. And that was the starting point for our discussion. What do we think peace looks like? What does peace really look like? And I think, at least in my case, in my class, the understanding became peace is messy, peace is difficult, peace does not happen overnight. And how do you take a picture of peace? So by way of kind of wrapping us up and moving into the panelists who'll be talking about their bodies of work, I just wanted to mention that I had a book that came out this year, and it was looking very closely at the photojournalistic coverage of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter. And 2020 was an absolutely unprecedented year for all of us, but for photojournalism especially. There were enormous obstacles and threats and risks that just had not existed prior to 2020. And so the book is an exploration of that, of these kind of seismic shifts that were occurring that photographers were grappling with and that photo editors were grappling with, because again, I structured this as interviews. But what I noticed when I did these interviews is that I was also hearing more language that conformed to the way I was thinking about and teaching piece photography. And so I just drew forward a few of those examples to wrap up my presentation with. One was about the question of privacy. So in the United States, if you're on public property, you have the legal right to take a picture, any picture that you want. In 2020, probably for the first time, at least a noticeable subset of protesters were demanding that photojournalists not take pictures of their faces. And this stemmed from concerns about updates in surveillance technologies. If you take my picture and it's published, will authorities like the police be able to read my identity in this image? Will they come after me later? Will they target me or harass me? And it led to, in my opinion, some very interesting debates. So photojournalists on one side saying, not only is it my legal right to take this picture, it's my duty as a photojournalist to create the documentation, to bear witness and to show you what is happening at this moment. On the other side, there were other photographers who kind of subscribed to what has become known as a do no harm photography. Like, don't put the subjects in your photos in any kind of potential risk. And so I drew forward this one quote from a photographer named Nina Berman, where she talks about one example of covering a protest where she was asked not to take pictures of faces. And instead of just saying, but I have the legal right, she decided to use that as a challenge. And she says, could I cover this another way? What would that look like? I ended up being a far less aggressive in-your-face photographer. I was more sensitive to the temperature of the crowd, right? So this is just one of the topics that came up. Another one that I pulled forward from my new book is about the limits of photography. Patience Zalonga is a photographer based in Minneapolis, where of course George Floyd was murdered. And she questions the traditional photojournalistic caption, which is who, what, where, when. Her point is nobody gives you the why in the caption. And this really resonated for me because how do you show the why? And I know that George Floyd was a video, but let's say it was a photo. How do you show the history that led up to the moment of that man's murder? How do you do that in a single frame? How do you show a systemic injustice? How do you show endemic racism in a picture? And she also talks about how she tries to create imagery that counters dominant narratives. And so what she says about this photograph is, it doesn't look newsworthy. You might walk right past this, but this is actually an important photograph because it challenges those dominant visual tropes about Black men in the United States, particularly connected to Black Lives Matter. And she says this is very much connected to Black Lives Matter because this is taken in George Floyd Square. And so she wants to think about how to use the camera to reframe some of the narratives. The final image that I'm going to show today is this one. And as I said, the book is about both Black Lives Matter, but also about covering COVID. And I put this one in here by way of saying that this is all really complicated and really difficult in thinking through peace or peaceful photography, because it's one thing to say, all right, then we shouldn't just take pictures of death or violence or gore. But as Rodrigo Abd says, and he's a photographer based in Peru, which had the highest per capita COVID mortality rate in the entire world, but the government underreported those numbers for over a year, which led to greater deaths because the population did not understand the severity of the virus. And what he says is, you have to document death. You have to show that things get graphic. It's the only way to document the truth of the story. And if you're not doing that, you're censoring the story. And that's not what we should do. We're journalists. So he talks about trying to do it as respectfully as possible, but he also kind of throws in this tension of it can't just be all peaceful, especially when there is violence or injustice or rampant lies from a government, right? However we want to frame conflict, you have to kind of create the evidence of what is happening. And then also, at least with my course, we thought about ways to push towards what could be termed peace. So that's my kind of quick overview of how I came at this topic and what we were doing inside my course. And I'm just so excited to hear from a bunch of photographers speaking very specifically to their areas of expertise. So thank you. I'm not sure who's up next. Maybe Steve?
Steve, you're muted.
Okay, who's Glenn talking to? He looks like he's trying to talk. And he's muted too. Okay. You want me to just start, or you have an introduction?
Yeah, whenever you'd like to.
Well, actually, Steve, we would like to let the audience know who's
Okay,
speaking. So let me just give a brief overview from the website, the program website. Steve Cagan has been practicing activist photography since the mid-1970s. His major work is in what is often called documentary, but what Steve prefers to call activist or socially engaged photography. He's most concerned with exploring strength and dignity in everyday struggles of grassroots people, resisting their pressures and problems. Major projects include factory closings in Ohio, Indochina, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Cuba, and Work in Ohio, an extended portrait of working people. Steve has taught at Mason Gross School of the Arts, Rutgers University, co-author of This Promised Land, El Salvador, which was a 1991 Book of the Year Award of Association for Humanist Sociology, and in 1991 named Teacher of the Year at Rutgers University. The third major event that spring was being denied tenure at Rutgers. Okay, Steve.
okay. Thanks. All right, I'm going to try to get my okay, and good. I'll start. First, I just want to thank Glenn and SDN for the invitation, and Meg for the invitation to participate in this panel, and thanks to everyone who's attending for your interest in these very important issues, even though the attendance is virtual, of course. So, although I've had the opportunity to work in 3 countries during periods of conflict and so-called post-conflict, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Colombia, I'm not what's sometimes called a conflict photographer. I'm more interested in showing the conditions and the pressures that normal people have to bear, and especially about their formal and informal forms of resistance. Okay. One of the important differences between El Salvador and Colombia is that in El Salvador, you could actually identify when the war ended. In Colombia, as we'll see, conflicts are still going on. Additionally, it's very difficult for the Colombian government to accept post-conflict programs, as they never recognized that a conflict existed. Also in El Salvador, things were perhaps easier to understand because there were really only 2 important forces in the post-conflict. The FMLN, which had become an important political party here, active in the election campaign of 1994, and the right-wing Arena Party. Tragically, the period also saw the beginning of a wave of extremely violent criminal activity, which sadly continues until today. In Colombia, the situation is much more complex. There are numerous serious electoral parties of the left and right. You may know that in the first round of the presidential election 10 days ago, the 2 leaders were precisely a left-wing activist and a Trump-like right-winger. To add to this, there are different armed groups. Although there was a peace accord signed between the national government and the largest guerrilla group, the FARC, 6 years ago, everyone agrees that the FARC has carried out their obligations and the government has not. So some disaffected FARC fighters have taken up arms again. In addition, the guerrilla group, the ELN, and the right-wing paramilitary groups are in active combat. The police and armed forces are at best useless, and at worst, oppressive and violent towards the civilian populations. And additionally, the rise of even more criminal gangs adds to this violent stew. All these groups are active in the area where I mostly work. As I mentioned, I'm not a conflict photographer. And in any event, their extremely violent behavior has kept me away from much contact with these groups, much less trying to photograph them. My family thanks me for that. Because of other commitments here in the US, all my work in Latin America for 40 years has been in visits. I've never lived in one of these countries for more than 5 months, and most of my visits have been between a couple of weeks and a couple of months long. This, I'll admit, has had a somewhat limiting impact on my photographic practice. Since 2003, most of my work has been in Colombia, and the bulk of it in the department of El Chocó in the northwest of the country. There, I am active supporting local communities and organizations with my photography. All the rest of the images I'm going to show today are from El Chocó. It's a coastal rainforest area of natural beauty and incredible biodiversity. There are very few roads, but many rivers and marshes. This natural treasure is not merely threatened, but is already suffering great damage from mechanized gold mining and an irresponsible rhythm of logging. The population, not very dense, except in the few cities and developed towns, is about 80 to 85% descendants of enslaved African people, and about 10% indigenous, leaving only 5 to 10% of the population mestizo or white, which is quite different from most of Colombia. The people there have suffered the effects of armed conflict, of monoculture agricultural projects, of terrible corruption by public officials, and from neglect and abandonment by the national government. The ongoing violence and increasing power of the armed groups has had extremely dire consequences for the communities and for the natural environment. For instance, here's the Rio Quito, destroyed by many large gold mining dredges. When a coalition of groups and communities along the river invited a group of scientists from the UK and Ireland to study the situation of the river, the paramilitaries who control much of the river made clear that the scientists could not enter, could not make their contribution. It was essentially a death threat. So they had to work outside the area of most concern. Meanwhile, communities along the Rio Bojaya have been harassed and threatened by both paramilitaries and ELN guerrillas, and really are being held hostage in their own villages. The all too common displacement of communities by the violence weakens local institutions, makes people dependent on supporting agencies, threatens community solidarity, and has serious effects on the psychological health of adults and children. Well, in Chocó, the main demand that people make on the national government is that it start to govern, to put a stop to the violence, to stop the destruction of the environment by mechanized gold mining and indiscriminate lumbering, to provide the normal government services in education, health and sanitation, recreation, and so on. Here are some of the ways that I see people in the area resisting the pressures of the armed groups and the threats to their rainforest environment and traditional cultures. By organizing advocacy groups and grassroots organizations, by organizing protests, by working to develop and preserve traditional cultures, by participating in social activities that promote the sense of community, community connection, and solidarity. And honestly, what for me ends up being the heroic labor of looking for work, feeding their families, getting the kids ready for school, keeping the home together, despite the pressures from the armed groups to abandon those very homes. In this situation, I see my role not so much as documenting, though of course this is a part of any photography that we do, but more as creating a space for photography as activism. Over time, I've come to understand some criteria for judging whether a particular project seems to me to be an activist one. The first criterion concerns my motives in undertaking the project. Of course, we all always photograph for a variety of reasons to accomplish a variety of things, but activist photography requires that the primary reason to do the work is to contribute with our cameras to a campaign, a project, a movement for social justice, for social change and justice. It's a modest contribution. I hope we've all figured out that photography, even through the great famous photographers, doesn't change the world by itself, but only by supporting communities and organizations in struggle. A kind of humility is needed in this work. The knowledge that, especially when you cross cultural boundaries, things may not be as they appear, and you have to learn. Once I accompanied a health delegation on a visit to a small Embera indigenous community. I was impressed when I saw they had constructed a kind of hut, and within there was a sort of community kitchen where they prepared their breakfasts and lunches for the whole community. Imagine my disappointment when I learned that this existed because the people knew our delegation was bringing a lot of food for people. That is, instead of taking pictures of what seemed to me a very positive activity in the normal daily life of the community, I was taking pictures of a distortion in daily life that we ourselves had produced. Of course, it was still positive, but it wasn't at all what I thought, and that was an important lesson. The second criterion is the development of relationships based on mutual understanding and respect with the communities or organizations working for change. You can do good journalism without establishing such a relationship, and good classical documentary, although perhaps with some of the historical baggage of that practice as well. But activism requires a living, organic relationship with the groups we're working with. The goal is to be part of their movement, to go beyond being a sympathetic outsider. Doing this work across cultural boundaries requires not only an openness and the humility to accept the need to learn about the cultures we're visiting, but also an approach to the frequent inequalities of privilege and power between ourselves and the people we're photographing. We can't eliminate those issues, but one way of managing them is precisely to let our work be directed by the needs of the communities and the organizations. That's why these relationships are so important to me. One thing that the understanding that comes from this openness teaches is the importance of avoiding portraying people simply as victims. Even when people have been victimized by war, oppression, or even natural disasters, they are also resistant, resourceful, creative, loving, hardworking, active in their own defense, and it's important to portray them in a complex and respectful way. Otherwise, we risk contributing to their victimization. Finally, among the criteria that define activist photography for me, a critical one is that my images have to actually be used in the work of those communities and groups, and of solidarity groups as well, in order to have an active life. They have to be a tool in the campaigns, the projects, the movements. Here are some examples of how my photographs have been employed by different groups. For instance, in the annual publication of the Human Rights Office of the activist Catholic Diocese of Quibdó, or in a report by an important national group working on environmental justice issues, and in a book about the displacement and eventual return of a community threatened by paramilitaries. In a report by Amnesty International, and in a publication of a progressive, solidarity-oriented Catholic university. An informal exhibition in the Cathedral of Quibdó years ago, organized in conjunction with a national Women's Peace March there, gave me a sense that the work is well worth doing when a couple of people came up to me in the street to thank me for, quote, telling our story. And finally, one use of the work which I'm especially pleased about is a book I did with a collaborator and a friend about the environmental and social damages of mechanized gold mining. The physical book was published in Colombia, and we have made English and Spanish versions available as ebooks. Perhaps the greatest satisfaction has come from the use of this book in training and orientation by different organizations. It's at moments like these, seeing this use, that you feel you're really making a contribution, that it's all really worth the effort. That's my presentation. Thanks for your patience. Here's some ways to look at my work or contact me.
Thank you, Steve. That was fantastic. I'm going to stop sharing your screen. And let's see, we lost Meg. She's having some computer problems. So I'm the next speaker chronologically. We started with Steve because the crisis, the war, the conflict in Colombia started the earliest. Then we'll move on to Bosnia, where the war began in 1992. So, I mean, it's such an honor to be on this panel today because this is really the first time in the 14 years since I've founded and run the Social Documentary Network that I've had an opportunity to talk about my own photographic work and the issues that inspired me to start this organization in 2008. Between 1995, when the war was still going on in Bosnia, until 2007, 7 years after the war ended in Kosovo, I made nearly 10 trips to the former Yugoslavia as an activist, humanitarian aid worker, and photographer. I cannot talk about my photographic work in Bosnia without also talking about what drove me to go there in the first place. It was not to take photos. Rather, for 2 years prior to my first trip in January 1995, I was consumed by a conflict, or really a genocide, that I watched unfold before me. Growing up Jewish, the concept of never again meant something to me. And here it was happening again, in the same part of the world where 6 million Jews were slaughtered 50 years earlier. This time, Bosnian Muslims were being singled out for slaughter, mostly by nationalist Serbs, who were the Bosnian Muslims' Orthodox neighbors, whom they shared the nation of Yugoslavia with before it began to disintegrate. But it was really a three-way conflict between Bosnians, Croatians, or Serbs. But that simplifies the matter, since Bosnia is a multi-ethnic society, unlike the other two. So the conflict really was between Bosnian Muslims against the other two sides, and not to belittle the separate and vicious conflict separately between Croats and Serbs. In 1993, I co-founded an organization in Western Massachusetts called Friends of Bosnia that was involved in advocacy to support Bosnia's defensive efforts, providing humanitarian and reconstruction aid to war victims and public education in the US about the war and eventual peace efforts. This is not unlike so many organizations today that are supporting Ukraine. A huge difference, though, is that today, the US is sending billions of dollars in military aid to Ukraine. When the war began in Bosnia in 1995, though, there was a UN-imposed arms embargo on all the entities of the former Yugoslavia, including Bosnia, and they were being denied the weapons needed to defend themselves. The arms embargo may have seemed like a good thing, except for the fact that the aggressors, Serbia, inherited the massive military resources of the former Yugoslavia and used them against Bosnia. Bosnia, on the other hand, was left with nearly nothing. In 1994, Friends of Bosnia collected a 40-foot shipping containers worth of food, medicine, and clothing that we shipped over to neighboring Croatia. In February 1995, I flew to Germany and met a convoy of trucks from Scotland, where we continued on to Croatia to pick up the contents of our container, as well as aid they brought from Scotland, and made 3 trips into Bosnia to deliver the aid. This is where my photos begin. This presentation is not meant to be either a comprehensive history of the war, nor is it meant to be an exploration of image making during war and peace. And because of the time allotted, most of my photographs will be during and shortly after the war. This is a presentation of photographs that I took while a photographer and activist to attempt to bring some semblance, justice, peace, and reconciliation to this war-torn land. And I hope these photographs will also give you a deeper understanding of what happened in the heart of Europe 30 years ago. So let me get to the photos. And let me get to the beginning of them. Okay. Okay, so we start off in 1994 with Friends of Bosnia when we had this aid drive collecting aid in Western Massachusetts. This is at our warehouse in Springfield, packing up boxes before putting them into a shipping container. Here's the shipping container just before it's sealed. You can see some medical equipment in the front. Here's one of our activist members, and here's the truck driver that will bring this container to a port in New Jersey and then be shipped over to Croatia. So I met this group, Edinburgh Direct Aid in Germany. They had 5 trucks. Here we are driving down into Bosnia, and we stopped at a rest area in Germany just to spend the night, cook dinner. We slept in the trucks. We did that most of the time when we were in Bosnia, when we couldn't find other places to sleep. Here we are entering into Bosnia. That's one of the trucks in front of us. I'm in another truck. This is a very common scene, blown up infrastructure, and then a temporary pontoon bridge. You see these bridges all the time in Ukraine now. Here we are going over Mount Igman. Mount Igman is a mountain that you cross over to get into Sarajevo. During the war, before the war, it was rarely used for vehicular or truck traffic, but during the war, it became the only safe route into Sarajevo. So this is the route that we and many other people took. It was mostly controlled by Bosnian government forces, although there were Serb forces on the other side of the mountain, but we were protected here. This is what we encountered when we came off Mount Igman on our way into Sarajevo. This is on the outskirts of Sarajevo, a town called Hracnica. And what we're looking at here is what's referred to as a collective center. The term refugee camp or refugee center was not used in Bosnia, particularly because very few of the people were technically refugees. They were displaced persons. So the refugees, the displaced people in this facility came from eastern Bosnia in the Drina River Valley that was overrun by the Serbs. And they were forced to flee to this relative safety. And I say relative because they were still subject to shelling by Serb forces on the mountains above them. Here are some pictures of the refugees in this center. This boy and some other children were from Gorazda. And I mean, we really don't understand, many people who have learned about the war through the media don't really understand what happened in eastern Bosnia and the Drina River Valley. These aren't places that most people have heard of, but it's really where some of the worst violence of the war occurred. When some of these pictures were taken, we're actually on our way out of Sarajevo and our trucks were nearly empty. And it was very disappointing to us and them that we didn't have any food or supplies to give them, but they were just very grateful that we were there and cared enough to be there and help their country. This is a mother and daughter I met on 2 trips into Bosnia that lived in that collective center. They were from Gorazda. This child was born shortly before they were forced to flee Gorazda. The mother, Nermina, wasn't even sure if the child, Melissa, would make it, but fortunately she did and thrived. This is crossing the airport, the Butmir airport into Sarajevo. This is a UN bunker, and it's a very telling sign about the UN, which played a very prominent and not necessarily productive role in Bosnia. The UN had a mandate to use force only to protect themselves, not to protect civilians. So here the UN bunker protecting themselves. There were many atrocities committed at the airport. Actually, the Serbs rounded up Bosnian refugees and transported them out of Bosnia in the full display of UN forces who didn't have authority to do anything about that. Here we are entering Sarajevo itself. These are the Eunice Towers and the largest commercial facilities, buildings in Bosnia that were completely devastated by Serb shelling. You may have heard during the war, if you remember then, that the Serbs were set up snipers around Sarajevo, and that's because they controlled the hills over the city. Sarajevo was a river valley, and there were hills on both sides, and the Serbs controlled one side of these hills and could just very easily shell and mortar into Sarajevo. This is the telecommunications building in Sarajevo. This is the market in Sarajevo, which was a scene of two bombings, each of them very significant besides of the humanitarian catastrophe. But the first one is really what got the public horrified by what was going on in Bosnia. About 60 people were killed in that bombing and forced Western powers to do more, even though they really did very little to stop the war. The second bombing in 1995 was actually the straw that broke the camel's back, so we speak, that finally forced the US government to use military force to end the war. This is a very common scene throughout Sarajevo at the time and other places. If you can see the dates on these gravestones, the date is 1992. This is very sad. The date on this headstone is 1893 to 1993. So this man was 100 years old when he died. Hard to say if it was from the war or other things. Here we are delivering aid in Sarajevo. We worked with the UN a lot that would provide us logistical support. They were very happy to bring us around in their trucks when they could. We sometimes stayed at UN compounds. And it's not to criticize the UN personnel. They're mostly all fantastic, but it was just the international system, the UN system, that did not provide a mandate to stop the violence there. This is a Sarajevo library. It's a very tragic story. It was shelled early on in the war, not by traditional munitions, but by incendiary devices, which didn't cause the building to crumble, but it burnt all the books on the interior. And for days afterwards, people said it was raining ash throughout Sarajevo. And these were priceless, irreplaceable manuscripts of Balkan and Bosnian history. And it was done for no other reason other than to erase the Bosnian nation, just like is going on today in Ukraine, where the Russians deny that Ukraine even exists as a nation. This is the interior of the library. As you can see, the damage is much more extensive on the interior. This is a bridge over the river in Sarajevo that's dedicated to this young woman, Suada Dilberovic, who was killed in 1992 on the day before the war began. The war began on April 6, 92. She was killed on April 5th when there was a large peace rally and some snipers started killing people from the roofs. The snipers were in the Holiday Inn nearby, and she was one of 2 people who were killed that day. This is a neighborhood of Sarajevo called Grbavica. This is shortly after the war ended and the UN was forcing the Serb occupiers out and allowing the original inhabitants, the Bosnians, to move back in or to open up the city. Grbavica was run like a prison camp by the Serbs during the war. I mean, Bosnians who lived there pretty much lived as if Jews lived in the Warsaw Ghetto. And after the Dayton Peace Accords, the place was finally opened up. This is the town hall in Grbavica where they're changing the sign for the new Bosnian government. These are 2 women who lived hundreds of yards apart during the war, but couldn't see each other because of the blockade of Grbavica. And here's the first time they've seen each other in a long period of time. And this was a very common scene that we witnessed in Grbavica during this time. This is a Jewish cemetery overlooking Sarajevo. It provided protection for the Serbs to shell Sarajevo. They were able to hide behind these gravestones. It's a very tragic situation that they did this and desecrated this cemetery. The Jews in Sarajevo were in kind of an interesting position. The Serbs really had nothing against the Jewish community. And actually there are a lot of Jews living in Serbia and a lot of Serbians who moved to Israel. So Serbia and Israel and Serbia and Jews had pretty good relations during the war. But the Jewish community provided a lot of aid to the Bosnian Muslims. This man, Jakob Finci, is known by many. He was the head of the Jewish community in Sarajevo, and they provided soup kitchens that would feed anybody who needed it during the war. This is Mostar, which was mostly the conflict between the Bosnians and the Croatians. The HVO is the Bosnian nationalist organization, military organization. That's one of our trucks there. You can see this hastily built cemetery. Here's one of our trucks driving through a street in Mostar. You can see one of the UN tanks there with a lot of great armament to protect themselves. The visible damage in Mostar is probably greater than any place else in Bosnia during the war. And this is one of many buildings with similar destruction. And these. Here we are in central Bosnia delivering aid. This is our truck, but you can see some UN personnel here and then some civilians off on the right here. This was a facility for the disabled, and it's an important point. During war, people in conditions like this really suffer the most, and the leaders of this organization I was with clearly understood this. So we went out of our way to deliver humanitarian aid to hospitals caring for the disabled. All right, I'm going to jump ahead to 2001, and these are photographs from Potocari, which is neighboring to Srebrenica. Potocari was where the UN compound was in 1995 when Serbian General Ratko Mladic overran Srebrenica, and thousands of Bosnians fled into the UN compound here for safety. The UN was not able to do anything or refused to do anything to help them, and it essentially abandoned their posts there and left these refugees, civilians to Mladic, and women were sent out on buses to Tuzla in Bosnia, but 8,000 men and boys were rounded up and subsequently murdered in a period of 2 or 3 days. So this is 6 years later on the 6th anniversary. Here are people coming to commemorate the anniversary in the fields outside of Potocari and Srebrenica. Here are men praying here. And this is what was the UN facility in Potocari. It's an old, actually, battery factory that was converted into the UN facility. And this is where Bosnians came to seek shelter, which they never got. Okay, I've totally lost track of time. And I don't know if I'm running over my 15 minutes.
You have about 2 minutes left.
Oh, okay, thanks, Meg. I'm glad you're back with us. So I'll go back into some photographs quickly of delivering aid in central Bosnia. This is an interesting photograph. The person on the left is from the UN. The person in the center, he's one of our convoy members. There are children from the community in the background. And the man on the left is a community leader, basically saying, who are you? What are you doing here? What do you want? And he's just really checking that we're legitimate, because you better believe there was so much fraud and abuse going on during the war in Bosnia and any war, and you can't easily trust anybody. This is Barbara Ayotte and myself in Dobrinja, a suburb of Sarajevo that was very heavily shelled and mined. I became aware of the mine problem here, and it became a huge problem after the war. And anywhere there's conflict, mines become a problem, and many civilians get killed later. quickly, my last trip to Bosnia in 2007. This is Sarajevo, which is an extraordinarily beautiful city. If anybody ever gets a chance to go there, I encourage you. This is the old part of town, Bashcharsia. But here we are visiting with refugees from Srebrenica who had resettled into communities around Sarajevo. There was nothing left for them in Srebrenica, and they were trying to find opportunities in and around Sarajevo, and they were being resettled by an aid organization. I know I'm going over time, but this is a really interesting story. The man on the left here, Merzudin, he is a survivor, one of the few from Srebrenica. He actually feigned death during the shootings. He made believe he was dead, and when the Serbs finally left, he was able to escape and to safety. And here he is with his sister. I just don't want to forget that Bosnia is an extraordinarily beautiful country. This is a more mountain area. Here we are working with some children at a school. And lastly, so myself, Barbara Ayotte, and Frank Ward, who we went on many of these trips with photographing. All right, well, thank you. And we're going to go on to the next speaker, Allen Storey. Carol's an award-winning documentary and reportage photographer specializing in chronicling complex humanitarian and social issues. In 2009, Storey was appointed a UNICEF ambassador for photography. A native New Yorker, Carol resides now in London. Her work has been exhibited and published internationally. Her solo exhibitions include The Amahoro Generation, Teens and the Loneliness of AIDS, Fractured Lives, Children of Hope. Storey has won and shortlisted for multiple international awards. Recently, she won first place for the Julia Margaret Cameron Award for 3 consecutive years. In 2022 for her series, Rape as a Weapon of War. In 2021 with her series, Out of the Shadows. And in 2020 with her series, Healing the Scars of Genocide. She is a graduate with distinction of the Central St. Martin's Master's Photography Program in 2000, and she has further degrees, including a BA from Syracuse University and an MA from Columbia University. Right, and I'm going to share Carol's work from my computer. So give me a second while I pull it up and share this. Share screen.
I'm so glad you're doing this, Glenn, because if it was over to me, you would see absolutely a void going nowhere.
I'm happy to do it. Okay, take it
Thank
away, Carol.
I'm delighted to be a part of this panel. The foreigner with a New York accent living in London, where I have lived virtually my entire adult life since I'm in my early 20s. I thought I would, all of the imagery that I'm going to be showing today is dealing with the aftermath, really, of war. And it's the area that I'm most interested in. I'm not interested in being there when there's blasting and bombs and bloods. I really am more interested in seeing how people cope, how people are managing living after a massive destruction of their countries. And I've selected this picture as the first one. It's a picture I photographed in Rwanda. And in the foreground is Rwanda. And in the great distance there with the rolling hills is Burundi, which is in the south of Rwanda. There's something wonderful about that picture that I've always loved. When I was driving with my fixer, and we were covering this story, which is called Healing, which is a very important aspect of post-war. I said, stop. I said, I just thought it was the most glorious imagery I've ever seen. And he reminded me of this particular lake that we're looking into, that during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis from the Hutus, that this lake was filled with bodies and blood, and that all you can see was blood. But Rwanda, for me, is one of the most beautiful countries I've ever visited in my life. It's absolutely astonishing with all the hills. And there's a wonderful Rwandan saying, and I'll read it out to you because I think it says it all. It is written, when God wanders the world, at the end of the day, he comes to Rwanda to sleep because he considers this to be the most beautiful place on the planet. I don't know who the author is, but it is a Rwandan folklore saying. Next slide, please.
Oops. Oh, all right. Press this little button here that says next
I can't
slide.
even begin to blame myself of not putting my finger on the right thing.
Let's see, I don't know what the
Right,
problem.
try that one. That should do it. No?
Let's see, Carol, what is the problem here? I don't.
You're asking me, this is the wrong person. That's the next slide. That's fine. That's super fine. One of the, almost 100% of the work that I undertake are for international NGOs. I'm a UNICEF ambassador for photography, and I do work with UNICEF and UNHCR. I also work with one of the leading international peace-building organizations called International Alert, and I've done many projects with them, all about building peace in the aftermath of wars or within a conflict. I work with Save the Children and so on. But it's all about building peace. It's all about what is required for reconciliation, for forgiveness, to move a country on after the horrific battles and the scars that it has experienced. In Rwanda, uniquely, I think it's unique, every year they have a commemoration of what had happened during the genocide of 1994, where more than 1 million Rwandan Tutsis were slaughtered by the Interahamwe. And the Interahamwe was a militant group, youth. It was the youth of Rwanda at the time, and smoldering in the hatred that had been building over for 30, 40 years. This wasn't just an instant thing that happened. Yes, the plane was shot down and the president was murdered, and the incite to revolt was fired up by the radio. But at the end of the day, that fear, that hate was smoldering for many, many years. And in this period of remembrance, there are sites all over the country that have graves that they dig up. And what you can see from here is you see clothing that is hanging up. And the reason these clothes are hanging there is for people to come by in any of the regions throughout the country to see something that they might identify as one of the victims. And it allows them to mourn because they say, okay, the bones are here, and I can now know that this body is here. And every year, what also happens during the commemoration period, which is unique, is perpetrators, because they want forgiveness, they actually come out and they say, I know another grave. I know where I buried people. And so every year, thousands more bodies are coming up. This is the 28th year since 1994 of the commemoration. And I just recently came back from Rwanda doing a different story, which is about raped teens. But being there, because I know the people very well, and I've been working in Rwanda for almost 20 years, they said, Carol, do you want to come see? We have another grave site that we've been able to build and find out what was going on. And it's harrowing to see the workers that go there. I dare not ask the question, who is digging up these graves? Is it what was known as Hutu or Tutsi? Because Rwanda today does not use that term. The term is used, we are Rwandese, we're Rwandans. And if you talk about Hutu and Tutsi, you're dividing a nation, and we need to unite the nation. Next slide, please.
Okay, the button to advance is not working, so I'll just go back to the directory each time.
Okay. The gal in this picture, her name is Aline, and before the genocide, her and her family were in Uganda. They lived there in exile. They were Tutsis. and they were farmers. But when they came back after the genocide, they become a part of, she in particular became part of a healing group that was an organization that was pulled together with International Alert. And I always ask questions, interesting, Laura, what you said is, what does peace look like? And I always ask them, what does peace look like and how can you define peace? And she says something to me, like, basically she says, conflict creates trauma for everyone. And through this program of healing, what she says she learned is that Hutu and Tutsis, if we continue to think about them as separate people, we're never going to have a united nation. So the most important thing for me is to forgive and heal. And as a nation, the most important thing for us to progress, we're a tiny nation. We don't have a lot of natural resources. We have to live in harmony. And we cannot promote ethnicity and separation. And if you look at the t-shirt she's wearing as a survivor, I thought it was rather interesting. The next slide, please. Oh, we missed one, but never mind. We're not in order. Never mind. I'll just read from.
Carol, I'm going by the order here that shows the slides.
It should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, I think I see the problem. There's a different number, but I don't know.
It all should be under healing because I.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah. That's fine. Her name is Florence, and during the genocide, she was living in exile in the DR Congo. And she had no idea of how horrific the crimes were at the time of what the Interahamwe were doing in the most horrendous acts of rape and butchery, like you cannot believe. And telling the story of, well, I heard that my aunt, when the Interahamwe came into her house, they cut her husband's legs off and asked him to dig his own grave. Then all of the soldiers raped her. And then at the end, after they had slaughtered all her children, the last child that was alive was a 12-year-old boy. And they said, well, saddle up on your mom and rape her as well. And when you hear these stories, you just cannot believe that that kind of butchery existed. And she lived in total isolation until she became a part of a program to help deal with the trauma. Because the biggest issue in the aftermath of any war is always trauma and trauma healing and forgiveness. Next slide, please. This is Edward and Belina. Edward and his wife are curiously, I am reportage, this is not posed. He went into the house to get his wife and his son. And I just said, can you just hold it a minute? Because they were going to come and sit down. I usually spend 2 or 3 hours with everyone that I ever interview. And my camera never comes out in the beginning. I want to kind of, learn more about what their world is and what their life is. And I say to them, what do you want to know about me and why I'm here and so on. And obviously, when I say very obviously, I do not speak the local language, which is Kindawandan. For me, it's a cross between Sweden and Russian, and I'm never going to wrap my mouth around anything they say. But their story was unique. He, in particular, when he described what he had witnessed during the massive work that the Interahamwe had done when they came to his village, he said the only reason he was able to survive is that he buried himself under the dead bodies. And he was saved by a neighbor who was Hutu, who took in over 100 neighbors. He was he became very famous. He's almost a saint in Rwanda now. And that's the only reason that he was able to survive. But what was interesting about him and many of the others that I interviewed, a local NGO called Never Again Rwanda has an amazing program. It's called the Space Program. And they usually have 20 people in each program for a year. And once you come into the program, and it could be perpetrators' daughters, it could be survivors' sons, grandparents, and so on. And it takes a while for everyone to be able to open up, to actually talk to one another. And once they have the 20 people, they're supposedly not talking about it to anyone outside it, and no one from the outside can come in for 1 year. And that's pretty much how it operates. And he said that without this space program, he didn't think that he would ever be able to, his soul to be healed of the atrocities that he witnessed. Next slide. I'm going to run through these pretty quickly.
I don't know if these are necessarily in the order that you.
They're not in the order, but that's okay. This is Alina and Odette. They're survivors of the genocide. Alina is the older woman, and Odette is her daughter. Both of them had their families slaughtered, their husbands, their children, and they were both brutally raped by the Interahamwe. The elder woman, Alina, said that she has found it in her heart, going through trauma healing processes, to forgive, where Odette said she can never forgive. She had burst into tears, and when she was describing, these are very sensitive moments, and I have to be very careful when I'm interviewing these people, because I'm asking them to relive the pain that they had experienced. So you have to really, I try very hard to always think about respecting who they are and what they're doing. But what was unique about this particular visit, and my fixer that I work very closely with in Rwanda, they were expecting us. And after we had a session of a couple of hours, and living in abject poverty, they had prepared a small meal of roasted parsnips and whatever. And they said to us, which I nearly fainted, they had never had their picture taken. They had never seen a camera. And the little mobile phone they had was one, probably from 1998. And so I did a few snaps on my mobile phone just to show them what they look like. Absolutely extraordinary. Next slide. One of the key things that working with the youth of Rwanda, and what is very uplifting, is theater and dance. And there's a wonderful dance that they do, which is all about what they say. It's called ineza. And ineza in definition means kindness. And with kindness, you have a future. And the music is wonderful. And I spent some time with a variety of different youth clubs that specialize in drama and poetry and also in dance. Next. I'm sorry about this. I don't know why it's not working. Most of the work that I do is in very remote areas. But for this particular project, which was about healing, I wanted to also capture some of the youth and the people that live in more what we can characterize as middle-class Rwandan. And this is in Kigali. And very typical middle-class, as we would know as a middle-class Rwandese home. He's a university student, and I asked him, what he was studying, and you can see there's a computer in the background. And he said, computer studies. And I said, well, what do you plan to do with that? He said, well, all of us in Rwanda know that the most important thing is that there's no industry here. So for me, I have to be inventive and I have to be an entrepreneur. Otherwise, I'm not going to have a future. But for him, he said during the a peace club that he belongs to, the most important thing that he learned is what he characterizes as critical thinking. Critical thinking for him translates into listening and thinking before you act. And he says, and that's the way you can prevent a war. You think and you listen before you act. Because the genocide ideology, as he described it, engages people who don't think. It's all about preaching hate. And once you preach hate, you're going to have war and not peace. Next.
So
Throughout Rwanda, you're going to find many of these genocide memorials. This one that was erected, and you can see things are all written in English now. No longer are things written in French, and that's a whole other story whatsoever. This was a church. It's a very famous church in Kibera. It's a memorial, and it had housed many Tutsis who were hiding from the Hutus during the raging of the war. But they were unstoppable, the Interahamwe. And although the church and the priests tried to protect the Tutsi, they failed at it, and thousands of their lives were lost in this church. But the genocide memorial that has been established is nestled close to the church, provides, I think, a respite and a reminder of the lives lost in that church. And on the left-hand side of the image, when I was there the first time, what you see now is a cover-up, but in there, in all those boxes, were just the bones, just bones. Next. We are so out of never mind. She's a superstar to me. I told her I was going to come back after she graduated university, because I asked her, I said, what is your dream? What's your ambition? What do you want to do after you leave university? And she spoke perfect English. And she said very simply to me, we have a great leader in Paul Kagame, and he has certainly recognized the role of women, where we have over 60% of our ministers are female and 50% of the ministers. She said, but for me, I want to become the first president of Rwanda. And I think she's smart enough that she's actually going to end up doing it. So let's watch and see what Jean is going to do. Just to remind everyone, this is from a series I did called The Amahoro Generation. And this was a commission by International Alert. It was the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And we had a massive exhibition, outdoor exhibition, on the South Bank in London. And it was supposed to be up only for 6 weeks, but the organizers of the South Bank came back to us, and we had it at the end of August into September. It's had such an amazing response. Can we hold it over for another 6 weeks, which was astonishing. And it was an opportunity for me to go and speak to the people, because most people didn't understand who's Hutu, who's Tutsi, and it was an educational tool. Also because we invited schools to come along and have an idea of, where is Rwanda on a map, and who are the people, and what's the difference between Hutu and Tutsi, and what created the war, and so on. And it was a very positive, I think, exhibition in allowing the youth to speak the word Amahoro, which means peace. Next, please.
Okay, in the interest of time, Carol, could we make this the last slide?
Is that the last one I'm going to do?
Yeah, if you'd like to try to find a different image, I can try to look around, but.
What I would like to do, because first of all the images I had done were not all in Rwanda. They were in the DR Congo and in Nigeria, where I did a major story about called Bad Blood. It was all about what the Boko Haram had done, kidnapping the girls, and then the girls get pregnant, and then they come back to the camps. There are 5 camps in the north of Nigeria, and some of them just kill the babies because it is considered bad blood. I'd just like to do the last slide that I have there, which was rape is a weapon of war. And only because I think it's very relevant today. That's not the last one, that's more from the Amahoro generation. If we can find the last slide. Very last slide.
Well, the last one here.
Rape, yeah, that's the one I wanted.
Okay.
I put this picture in because I'm finding it's so distressful to see and witness what's happening in the Ukraine today, that rape is a weapon of war. It is used to humiliate the enemy. And it has lasting effects for the people that have been violated in that way. This is a gal that was raped multiple times. And she said to me, when she was raped by all these different soldiers of the anti-Army, she said very simply, they said to me, we're not going to kill you because we want you to die a slow death. And all of us are HIV positive. So we're going to inflict that disease on you. She died about 3 weeks after I had taken this particular picture. And the reason I'm putting it up is because at this point, what is going on? Rape is used indiscriminately. Rape is one of the most dangerous weapons of war. And it's savage. And it's conducted by men. And I want to ask the question, when is that ever going to stop? Look what's going on in the Ukraine. Do you know an 8-year-old child died of the injuries of rape in the Ukraine last week? That's it.
Well, thank you, Carol. That was an extraordinary presentation with amazing photographs about a horrendous situation, but gives us hope as well for the future. Thank you. So Meg is going to introduce our last speaker, Shoun Hill. Meg.
Yeah, so Shoun Hill is a visual journalist and educator living between New York City and Lincoln, Nebraska. Originally from Frederick, Maryland, Hill began photographing professionally in 1993 for The Gleaner in Henderson, Kentucky, after getting his Master of Arts degree from Ohio University. At the present time, Shoun is an assistant professor at the College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, teaching photojournalism and multimedia. He has worked as a staff photographer for newspapers in Memphis, Tennessee, and Orlando, Florida, as well as being a photo editor on the national desk of the Associated Press in New York City. Shoun's documentary film on African-American farmers, I'm Just a Layman in Search of Justice, Black Farmers Fight Against USDA, was selected as the People's Choice at the Denton Black Film Festival, as well as honorable mention.
Thank you, Meg. Let me share my screen. Thanks. Thank you guys for having me. I'm very appreciative, and hopefully I can do the panel justice. I wanted to start out by saying I know quite a few of you guys have been in countries that have conflict and all that. For me, I haven't been in or gone to a country per se that has conflict. What I want to say is that as an African-American photographer, we have conflict every day when we go out to shoot. I want to give you a few examples. I was a staff photographer at the Commercial Appeal in Memphis. And when you're a staffer, there are some days where you just have to go out and try to find a feature of anything, anywhere. So I'm driving around and I see a situation where a mom is out with their 2 kids and they're gardening. I'm like, a perfect shot, perfect situation for a feature. So I get out, and mind you, when with every newspaper staff, you have 2 bodies, the whole 9. So I'm walking up to her and I see her gather her kids and go inside. And I'm thinking, I am carrying over $10,000 worth of gear on me. There's nothing that I would want from you at all. So, I mean, I told her who I was and what I was doing, but it didn't click with her, even with my gear and all that, it just didn't work. She saw my skin color and that was it. So that's some things that we have to deal with as photographers of color. And one other instance, I am walking in to a dirt track race. And as you know, dirt track races are pretty much the base for the last president's his base. So I'm walking in and I hear a car coming down, I don't turn. The car just misses me by, an inch or so. I'm like, okay, fine. I go in, I'm there to do a job. So I go in, do what I have to do. I meet the sports writer that's there, that's doing the story. We get everything, we're walking out. And as we're walking out, I hear that the same car yet again. And he misses me yet again, because I didn't move. And the reporter looks at me, he says, he's tried to hit you. I'm like, yeah, I know, it's like the second time. So just things like that, where for photographers of color in this country, it is an everyday battlefield. But I want to change from that. I want to talk about the first thing that I did, process that I covered that I haven't been able to follow up on per se emotionally. And that was the original Million Man March. The original Million Man March, I have to say, it was one of love, understanding, and yes, peace. There was no time during my, I don't know, 7 or 8 hours there where I sensed anybody being upset with one another. They just wanted to listen to the speakers, and they were just loving toward everybody. And it was, as you may remember, it was one of the largest crowds on the mall in DC. Before I go to the protest 2020, I wanted to offset the Million Man March for something I shot 2 years later, which was the first Ole Miss football game after the Confederate flag was, basically banned from the stadium. They got around it by putting it on a placard to, to wave around. And I'm standing there and I'm looking at a man, he's probably 65, 70 years old, handing out the placards, and he's saying it's heritage, not hate. And as I'm listening to him and, taking pictures, I also take pictures. And, as a photographer, photojournalist, you need names of people that you take pictures of. Not a single person that I took pictures of would give me their name. I became basically invisible to them. They just ignored me and walked straight by me, and I was not even a human to them at all. So I had to contrast that with the Million Man March. Protests in 2020 from George Floyd and all the cop killings, I needed and wanted to show the people as they are, and also the feelings in concert with the Million Man March. The Million Man March, it was very peaceful and loving. These protests were, in a way, it was a slow buildup. It was basically there was a frustration that people had, and they wanted a way to get people to realize how bad the situation is. I also wanted to show us there and us in a better light. Admittedly, during the night, the bad elements of both races came out and, sullied what people were trying to do. I did not shoot any of that. It wasn't something that I wanted to show. I wanted to show the positiveness of what they wanted. And also, it like I said, it ranged in ages from kids to older people, and you needed to see that in the different protests. in this, besides using the DSLR, I also wanted to use my phone and the different aspects that the phone could offer to show or give a different feel for the images that I was trying to take. In addition to that, I really needed to show the allies, like the white people, Hispanic people that were joining in on the Black Lives Matter movement, because you have to show all parts of it. You can't just show, okay, all the Black people are here marching, because that just distorts the story. And people, unfortunately, will not take it as seriously if they don't see a well-rounded protest. This was in Inwood, which is my former neighborhood. They all got together and had a peaceful protest after Mr. Floyd's murder. Once I moved to the Bronx, this was more student-led community protest. You know, I keep going back to this picture, and I keep thinking about her look. And part of me wants her to smile, but then if she's smiling, I don't think it hits home the same as it would with the look that she has now. When I go out and shoot, after I get the initial images that I want, and I've actually tried getting this into the heads of my students, is that I will take a step back and basically just walk around, just looking, trying to find something that I may have missed, you know, something to tell the story a little bit differently. The reason why this slide's blank and I have other images that are coming, it's pretty much like a buildup. Like I said, the Million Man March was the most peaceful and most loving environment that pretty much I've shot at for a crowd of a few million people. The Black Lives Matter protests, there was just frustration of being tired of having innocent Black men and women killed by the police. These images of the protests after the 26th election, there was a lot of anger because they just couldn't believe that that person was elected. And they pretty much, people felt helpless. This is short and sweet for me. I am done with my presentation. Again, I wanted to thank you guys for having me. It's been fun. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Shoun. Those were really amazing photographs. Fantastic story. I've seen some of these on the SDN website, but most of them I haven't seen previously. So thank you for sharing that.
Thanks.
And thank you for sharing that story. All right, so I'd like to open this up for questions now. If people can either post questions in the chat or use the raise your hand, or if you really just want to go for it, just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask a question. And nobody likes to ask the first question, so I'll go ahead and ask a question of Carol. Carol, there's been a lot of discussion in the international community the last few years about the politics of Paul Kagame in Rwanda today. I mean, he did great things after the genocide to pull the country back together, but it sounds like he's set up a benevolent dictatorship, and that it's a very rough time for people who are not in his graces. How is that experience day to day with people now in Rwanda? Carrie, you'll need to unmute yourself. Carrie, yeah, I'll unmute you. Go ahead.
Very quickly, as I said, I've been working in Rwanda over 20 years, and before we were locked down, I had made 3 trips, and I just recently, as you know, about 10 days ago, came back from Rwanda. Yes, you can call him a benevolent whatever, but the transformation of Rwanda over the last 28 years since the genocide will blow most people away. I, as a Mzungu, a white person, walking in the capital at midnight, I know I am fearless. Why? Because no one's going to attack me. I'm not going to be robbed. All the roads there are the best roads I've ever seen anywhere in an African country. They're all new. They work. Children have to go to school. If a parent, the first time a child doesn't go to school, a parent gets fined. The second time, the fine gets bigger. The third time, the parent goes to jail. Everyone goes to school. So where is the balance? I'm not going to get into the accusations of saying this person disappeared in Rwanda and that person and so on. At the end of the day, being in Rwanda and speaking to the Rwandese people all over the country, and I am all over the country, north, south, east, west, everywhere, I would say 90% of the people talking in the most remote areas, they think that Kagame and his government have done a marvelous job of reconstruction, of creating a platform for peace. And there are some bodies that are swept under the carpet. I haven't seen them, and I certainly am not oblivious to it. And certainly, you know, there's a major conflict here in the UK of what us shipping illegal immigrants to Rwanda on a one-way ticket, and all the humanitarian issues that are raised. My experience in being in Rwanda is that more people are prospering than they have ever before. The transformation of the city, when you go to Kigali, you actually are knocked out. The city is beautiful. It's super clean. And uniquely, wherever I was on this last trip, everyone has had vaccinations. Everyone. I mean, everyone. You know, I don't want to even go into the US or here, you know, the naysayers and all the rest. So Rwanda for me, it works. I mean, should Kagame have changed the constitution? No. Are there some underlining humanitarian issues? Probably yes. But overall, the country really works, and it is his vision. You know, I've spoken to him, I've interviewed him. When I asked him about why he, you know, there's so many women in government, he looked at me strangely. He says, Carol, 50% of our population are female. How can I not have them represented here? And they are. And the women are very dynamic in the government. They are the most dynamic of any country in the world. So there you go.
All right. Well, thank you. We have a question from Mark Silverberg. And Mark, would you like to just unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure, thank you. A lot of images we saw today, the context and meaning of the photographs comes across much more impactfully and powerfully when we know the story and the context of the story and the meaning the photographer is trying to convey. What do the panelists think about this relationship between image and the description of the image? In some cases, some photographers think no subtitles are appropriate. We want the image to stand on their own. What do each of the artists think of that relationship?
Well, I'll start because I have very strong feelings about this. As running a documentary organization, the Social Documentary Network, we are very committed to context to the photos. For our website, we require an abstract and highly encourage captions because for exactly the reasons you say, without that information, the photograph can't provide it all. On the other hand, there is a beauty in the visual pleasure of looking at a photograph and the information that can be gotten from it. But it's different than documentary where there's some context that's required. But I'd like to ask any of the other panelists, and including Lauren, if anybody else has an answer to this. Steve?
For me personally, oh, sorry, I'll just say a quick word and then Steve, over to you. For me personally, because I work so squarely in the realm of photojournalism, the idea of separating a photo from its at minimum caption and at greater its context is terrifying. I think that, like, I work in a space where the images are supposed to be used as documentation and to provide information to the public. So I would never want them cut from any degree in which they can be better housed with a context. And I think again, maybe I'm betraying a personal opinion, but when you're talking about conflict or injustice, or we've heard about rape, we've heard about death, we've heard about violence against the press itself, the stakes are really high. So I would never want a photojournalistic image to be seen simply as art.
Well stated, Lauren, and thank you for that. That's exactly my sentiment. You know, it's art. I don't think what I do when they say you're an artist, I want to really piss at that person, because I'm not an artist. I'm documenting, reality, and hopefully it will trigger change for the good.
But your photos are very artful, Carol.
Well, there's no conflict between aesthetic quality and content. There's no conflict. In fact, considering that we live in societies where there's a tidal wave of imagery, we have to have good images in order to get any attention to them. So I don't see any conflict. I'll just tell you one personal story about this, and there are several. Years ago, I visited the Light Gallery in New York, which had all the Eugene Smith photographs, and there was one of his pictures, one of his horrible pictures that he had taken in the Pacific War. In the Pacific during World War II, which he hoped would actually make war impossible after that. And in the Light Gallery, this picture was double or triple matted. It had a gilt frame around it, a very sophisticated lighting, and absolutely no context provided, except that it had been created, had been turned into an art object, an art commerce object. And so my mother, knowing that Smith was one of my heroes, asked how I felt looking at that picture. And I said, what I really feel, if I could really do what I feel, I would take that picture off the wall and smash it because Smith took these pictures to get us to see the horror of war, not, and he himself was certainly very involved in seeing his art, his work as art and so forth. But nonetheless, there is a content that is totally lost if a context of usually text, it doesn't have to be text, but some context, because photos are, as we say, polysemic, they can have many meanings. And I've always said that it's not about getting people to agree with me, it's getting people to, if they disagree with me, to disagree with what I was actually trying to say, and not some other interpretation. And I can only get that by providing the context.
Okay, Bruce Rosen had his hand up, but then he took it down. Bruce, would you like to ask a question or pass?
Sure. The question is, because I don't recall if any of them mentioned, have any of you worked teaching or mentoring young people, say high school students, in photography, obviously from a photojournalistic point of view, and if so, what's their reaction? And something came to mind because of what was just said about this gallery presentation. One of the sole European and German companies that went through the Second World War with an ethical reputation was Leica, which assisted its Jewish employees in getting out of the country when the Nazis came in and setting them up as long as they possibly could as distribution agents and the like in other countries on that. And that wasn't true of most of the private and public companies in Europe under Nazi control. So I think it's an issue that comes up now, obviously vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia of, that, but specific to this one of literally the tool for taking your photographs. But anyway, back to, have any of you worked with young people and teach them the craft and what their reaction has been?
I can speak to a bit with high school. So I'm for the US State Department, I'm the lead educator on media literacy in Bosnia. And I am currently tasked right now in the United States with developing middle school and high school curriculum on media literacy. So in my experience, it's not specific to photojournalism per se, but it's media literacy and visual literacy, which I personally find incredibly important right now in a moment where Meg, my student, is brilliant. But who knows, Meg, like students who are younger than you, but like you, they're digital natives, and they get all of their information off their phones. And even in my class with Meg, the war in Ukraine broke out about a month into the semester, and it was not a shock to me, but it was still enlightening to me to hear from almost all of my students that their modality for receiving news was primarily TikTok, which is not mine and likely not yours as your primary mode of information. So what I can say as an educator doing media literacy in various places around the world, I do find students very, very open to learning about this. They are so fluent in digital information landscapes, but not necessarily fluent in how to evaluate those landscapes. But I do, I love teaching college. I have been working more and more with high school, and I find the students very open-minded to listening and thinking about, ultimately my starting point for these projects is usually to try to get students to understand what's the role that journalism serves in society. And once that clicks, then you can go from that. Like, journalism has a fundamental purpose to a free and open society. And when that clicks, then you start the conversation about, so where do you get your information? How do you vet your information? So I can't speak specifically to photojournalism and high school students, I know, but this is a broader topic. Steve, I know you were nodding your head as a yes, and you might have a more photo-specific response.
Lauren, you hit upon a very important thing, and I'm glad this question was raised. I lecture at Central St. Martin's. I'm a fellow there, but I'm dealing with university students. And when I was interviewing all these kids dealing with war and what their view is war and how do you make peace, and asking them, where do they get their news? And they say, well, they only trust TikTok or Facebook and so on. And their literacy, the word you use, I think media literacy needs to be taught as a subject matter amongst teenagers.
I'm working on it.
Well, hurry up and make it happen.
I need like 4 months to finish the curriculum.
No, but truly, it's extraordinary. There's my grandson. I said, well, where do you get the news? He says, well, the traditional media is all fake news. I get it from TikTok.
Bruce, I'd like to answer your question because I have had the experience working with organizations in both El Salvador and Colombia of teaching young people. In El Salvador back to 1988, and I had a small group, and it was all clandestine. You know, we did kind of clandestine photo trips. You know, it was very interesting. And then only years later did I really understand that what I had been asked to do was to prepare the photo corps for the general offensive that was coming, the general guerrilla offensive. So that was interesting. They were very responsive, and they were interested in discussing how pictures work. You know, that was good. And then in Colombia, I've worked also informally with young people, high school age people who are interested in what in Latin America is called popular education. You know, learning how to take effective pictures that can be used in newsletters or and things like that. You know, and again, I have found them very responsive to that. I did have 8 years of teaching photography at Rutgers, and that was a wonderful experience because it wasn't so close, you know, to conflict, but it was. I found there was not all the students, but a bunch of the students were, and that's, you know, a largely working class university actually. And that a lot of the students were actually very responsive to talking about how pictures work, what the responsibility of a photographer is, you know, to both to the subject and to the audience. So I've had very good experiences in teaching.
Can I
Shoun,
just say what you just said and what your colleagues, because people have asked questions in terms of photography as an art, you all seem to be expressing it as a language. And obviously the same way, the way your students have reacted to it, that you're in effect writing with the visual images, which is one of those interesting things that human beings do. So I just thought I would note that. I'm wondering if it's your feeling as well, that you're in effect creating a story, obviously with your visual images. I think that's the intent over there, but as if you were writing them.
I'd like to ask Shoun, you just started teaching this year at Nebraska, I assume undergraduate students. Can you just comment what the state of teaching journalism is today to new college students and how that's working out for you?
Okay, so I just started this year, and basically my first class was a class, it's like a general education class, and silly me, I basically went from 0 to 60 in this class, and I pretty much lost them. However, there was one student that stuck with me through, like, I've taught like, I don't know, 3 or 4 other classes, and he's gone with me the whole way. There are students that want to be photojournalists and they understand the career. Now it's just so many universities don't have a lot of staff dedicated to it. Even at Nebraska, it's basically just me right now. So in order to build a program, it's going to take a second, but the need is there and the students want to do it, you know.
Great. And I also want to add that I don't teach myself high school students, but the Social Documentary Network started a program this year called the Visual Literacy Project to do exactly this. And we're now running programs in Holyoke, Massachusetts, where we're working with high school students, underrepresented high school students in an old New England mill town, we're to teach them documentary skills as a way for them to document their communities, to have control of the narrative of their communities, but also to help them be more engaged in education. You know, the traditional reading, writing, and arithmetic, while it's incredibly important, it's hard to engage them with that. So being engaged with these visual skills helps them stay more involved with the education process. And you can find out more about that at the SDN website. Well, I think we're already almost 15 minutes over, so why don't we bring this to a close? I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I'd like to thank all of our attendees, and really a shout out to Meg for curating this program. And if people just want to unmute themselves and applaud everybody.
I'm applauding all the other panelists. And if you'd be kind enough, I'd love to be, I have Lauren's, obviously I have her details, only because we collided at Photo London with the founder of the Frontline Club a couple of weeks ago, and she sent me her book, which I read religiously on my flight, and it was I highly recommend it. It's really well done. But Shoun, I didn't know your work, and I'm so glad that I've discovered you on this program. And
Thank you.
And please let me know if you're ever going to be through. I'm going to be visiting my daughter, who's a journalist, but she's a writer, not like her mummy, who's a snapper, and she lives in Brooklyn. So yay! Well, as Lauren, you know, I'm coming in October, so we're definitely going to rendezvous then. But I'd love to keep in touch with you guys. So
Yes.
if you if everyone agrees, if you can send me their emails, that would be sensational.
Great.
Absolutely. Okay, and again, this is recorded and will be on the SDN YouTube channel. So I hope everybody's well. Have a good week. Thank you. It's been a long day.
Ciao.